evening all. Thank you for joining me. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Come in, pull up a socially distanced seat, pour yourself a socially distanced beer. Thanks very much indeed for joining us for the latest in the IEA's In Conversation series. This is a series of broadcast events in which I sit down virtually with a politician or a businessman or a thought leader or an all-round newsmaker of some sort to discuss their life, their views, their philosophy, their ideas, and what they make of the world around us today. And before I introduce this evening's fantastic guest, let me just bore you with a few housekeeping rules. We're broadcasting this event simultaneously on two platforms, on Zoom and on YouTube. If you're on the Zoom side of the event and you want to ask our speaker a question, please put that question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, not the chat box. Use that to chat. Use the Q&A box to put a question that you would like me to put to our guest. And even if you're far too shy to ask a question yourself, all of you can vote on by giving the thumbs up to which questions you'd like me to put to our speaker. And being a very democratic kind of guy, I'll be taking the questions towards the top of that list and put them in as soon as they pop into your head. I'm going to be asking a few questions to kick things off, and then I'll come to the questions, but put them in as soon as you've got them in mind. So on to tonight's guest, Steve Barclay. Good evening, Steve. How are you? Wonderful of you to join us.
Good to see you, Mark. I think you've got the beer. I've managed to get a coffee, so that's one of the downsides of this virtual world.
Yeah, you need better staff, Steve. They brought me far too many bottles of beer, actually, lined up in front of me. So Steve Barclay's been the Conservative Member of Parliament for North East Cambridgeshire since 2010. He currently serves, of course, as the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. During his parliamentary career, he has variously served as Lord Commissioner of the Treasury, Economic Secretary to the Treasury, Minister of State for Health, and has also, of course, served as Brexit Secretary from November 2018 to January 2020. Before his life in politics, Steve was a qualified solicitor, worked for Barclays Bank as the head of anti-money laundering. So, Steve, in your present role, Chief Secretary to the Treasury, you're the main man whose job it is to ensure that the public finances are in a robust, rosy and healthy state. How's that going for you?
Well, I started in Parliament on the Public Accounts Committee. So I had 4 years where that's the committee really that works with the NEO to look at value for money. So in some ways, there's a natural fit. Previously, when I was in the Treasury as Economic Secretary, I was covering financial services, which was my sort of background career-wise. Whereas this role, I think, sort of fits very much with where my political focus has largely been, which has been on the view that we can do things differently, we can reform, we can be more data-driven in our approach to government spending, and very much the ethos I've tried to bring into the Treasury working with the Chancellor is to take a much more data-led reformist approach. So you're right, I sort of cover in terms of the role spending across the piece. This other flagship event is the spending review as sort of the key decision point, but also day-to-day, obviously the volume of spending requests from departments, particularly around COVID, which has a big Treasury element to it.
So let's look at the public finances. I mean, obviously, it's been one hell of a year, and it's worth me saying at the outset that I think even fiscal hawks at the Institute of Economic Affairs understand that these are the sorts of years in which governments would run deficits. You'd expect, whatever you think of the particular government schemes, it's hardly surprising that there's a substantial deficit this year. But it seems to me that that's only part of a wider problem in our public finances. I'm not panicked about the numbers, although they are eye-watering. I think the ONS number was that the budget deficit will be 300 billion this year, roughly twice what it was when the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition came to power. Obviously, the national debt's gone up as a consequence, touching perhaps just a bit below 100% of GDP, I think 97% or so of GDP at the moment. And we obviously have substantial long-term liabilities with an aging population and the rest, and the pensions, very substantial public sector and state pensions liabilities. So what do you think, in round terms, is the right strategy for fixing this? I'm not suggesting that the government can balance the books sort of on June the 21st, as soon as we hope lockdown fully ends, but there's going to have to be a serious plan, isn't there, to actually repair our public finances. No government of either colour, of any colour, has balanced the books since 2001.
You're right, Mark. I mean, look, you're a very close observer of this. You and I have spoken about it in the past. And I think the key thing, first and foremost, that my constituents, the electors I speak to, want to see from government is a very clear plan. And that is what the Chancellor has set out. First and foremost, the plan for jobs, a real focus on protecting as many jobs as possible through the furlough scheme, the self-employed income support scheme, the cash flow measures that have been taken, such as the bounce back loans, but also where particularly the young who have been most acutely hit, but all ages where they've been hit in terms of unemployment, and unemployment obviously has increased and is forecast to continue to increase, albeit less than would have been the case without the measures we've taken, is then to get people back into the labour market as quickly as possible. And that's where the doubling of work coaches and the various measures on apprenticeships and traineeships and so forth have come in. But I think that fits within a wider plan. And you heard Rishi talk about this at the budget. You know, in the first instance, it's weathering the storm of COVID, the support measures, and we probably went a bit longer perhaps than people expected through to September on those, but having that support in place, because the bounce back is quicker if we can keep that link between labour and their businesses. And as you say, I mean, these are huge sums of money. It's not what you and I in an ideal world would want to see, but it has reduced the economic scarring that would have happened otherwise. And I think most international observers do accept that. I think there's a second element to the plan that the Chancellor set out, which is weathering the storm, but then having a investment-led recovery. And that's where measures such as the super deduction to really incentivize businesses to invest, get that productivity moving. And that obviously fits in a wider package of previous announcements, particularly around infrastructure investment, the 100 billion that we're spending this year, the 600 billion overall over the course of the Parliament, significant spend in the sort of future we want for our economy, high skill, green jobs, investment-led, skills-led recovery. But the third really speaks to the crux, Mark, of your question, which is, it's not just the borrowing this year, which I think a lot of the public are aware of. A lot of money's been borrowed this year. I think what tends to get less focus is the borrowing next year and in subsequent years of the Parliament. I think the public are more cited on the borrowing during the pandemic, but not the fact that there is continued borrowing in the subsequent years. And that's why you hear from the Chancellor some difficult measures on corporation tax, for example, at the budget, on the income thresholds. It's why at the spending review we took the difficult measure on pay, obviously protecting those under 24,000, but some difficult measures on pay, difficult measures on ODA, which not all of my parliamentary colleagues have liked. So we've had to take some difficult decisions because of that wider fiscal position, but it sits within that clear three-point plan from the Chancellor.
Overall there, and I appreciate that you and other government ministers have been having to fight our way through a crisis, which, and certainly in its early iteration, it wasn't at all certain, right? We didn't know which demographic was going to be most affected, how long it was going to go on for, right? The initial intention, I think, was that the lockdown was going to be 3 or 6 weeks. Here we are a year later. So, you have my sympathies with the challenge of crisis management. But now, if we're beginning to get out of that at long last, with the vaccination programme having rolled out so successfully, really, in the United Kingdom compared to virtually any other country in the world, we do have some tough decisions to make, don't we? I mean, when do you think the government can balance the books? And should we not have a policy of seeking to run meaningful surpluses in the relatively good times? I mean, it sort of seems to me, through no fault of yours or politicians in general necessarily, but we're sort of permanently in a crisis. I said the last budget surplus run by the UK government was 2001. Then we had the 9/11 terror attacks, the economy goes down. 2008, the banking crisis, and then we were sort of told, oh, well, there's a recession, you can't cut spending now. Then the uncertainty around Brexit, an issue we'll come to later. Then COVID hits. I mean, there never seems to be an opportunity to mend the roof while the sun is shining. Do you not think it should be part of the strategy to say, well, things are normal, which they're not at the moment. We should be aiming to run a surplus of, I don't know, 100 billion a year, say, for sake of argument.
Well, I think, the immediate issue is we're still in the pandemic. We still haven't delivered the full COVID roadmap. So from a sort of government minister point of view, our sort of key focus at the moment is still on that, ensuring that we're able to get the economy reopened as hoped. And obviously for many businesses watching this, that's absolutely critical to them, to their livelihoods. And it won't surprise you as a Treasury Minister, that's absolutely, uppermost in my mind as well. I think, so that's our focus now. I think in terms of the economy moving forward, I mean, there's no secret, Mark. I mean, you and I have spoken about this before. There's three ways governments have money. They borrow it, they tax it, or they grow it through productivity. And the key focus, again, from a Treasury perspective, is how do we get that productivity that has been sluggish for many years? Past chancellors have talked, George talked about this, Philip talked about it. It's been difficult to get the productivity that we want, but that is where the investment in skills comes in. That's where the investment in infrastructure, it links into other key parts of the government agenda. So levelling up, which is our sort of strategic number one objective as a government, and we may get into that more in the questions, but how do we address some of the regional imbalances in productivity between London and some of our major cities? Because really that's the way we deal with the economy moving forward, is to get the growth into it, the productivity into it, and that's really the way, from a Treasury point of view, we want to steer things.
Well, is there any chance then that the Treasury or this government is going to discover or rediscover, let's say, fair liberalism? I mean, you're quite right, Steve. I don't disagree with you. You can borrow the money, you can tax the money. All spending becomes easier if economic growth is clipping along nicely rather than rather sluggishly, which it has been since the global financial crash. But it looks like the total average tax burden, if you just look at tax and divide it between the total number of citizens, so as a proportion of our income, is now probably at a 70-year high. This government, now I appreciate the last year has been an extraordinary one, but the government looks like it's going to tax us overall at rates of higher than that or equivalent to that of Clem Attlee's post-war government. Now, I know politicians are very good at saying, well, we've given this super deduction here or this increase in the income tax threshold there. But if you were just looking at the overall tax burden, it's pretty high at the moment. Isn't really the route to get back to productivity and growth in the private sector to lower the burden that is felt by workers, employers and businesses to get taxes down? They are eye-wateringly high, and a good number of economists might well argue that we are reaching the taxable limits of the economy, that dialing up rates in some areas now won't necessarily help the government with revenues. They might have a perverse Laffer curve effect where you actually see the rates go up, you discourage growth so much that the revenues actually into the government's coffers and its ability to conduct public spending programs goes down.
Yeah, look, it won't surprise you, Mark, as someone who came into politics, on the centre right, and the Chancellor likewise, that we would prefer to trust people with their money and prefer not to see, for example, the increase that's been necessary to signal on corporation tax, to take that as one example. But if I take that, we're still competitive in terms of the G7, still the lowest in the G7. So it's looking at what is our international position. You're right in terms of the percentage of GDP as tax at 35%, be high. And this is what we make to some of our parliamentary colleagues, because there's many of my colleagues who will still have lots of things that they want to see the government spending more money on. And these things, as I say, the focus has got to be on productivity, but we do need to be mindful that the tax burden in historic terms is higher. But it is a consequence of the situation that we faced. And my background is in rugby. You've got to play the conditions in front of you, whether that's on the pitch, whether that's in business, whether that's in politics. And we have had a pandemic that has required a level of borrowing much more than obviously forecast. Interest rates are at historic lows, so there are advantages in terms of the time of that, but also we're very mindful of the pressure that creates more widely.
So, Steve, you're on the National Economy Recovery Task Force, a cabinet subcommittee that's been tasked with devising a plan for growth. Part of me says I'm always sceptical about, central planning committees devising a plan for growth. Another part of me, though, says, hurrah. I think too often politicians of all stripes treat economic growth as if it's just an act of God, an entirely exogenous feature in our economy. It's not true that politicians can legislate for certain levels of growth, but they can create a more benign or a less benign climate. What sort of policy suggestions can we expect to see from this committee to make sure that we have not just a bounce back that allows us to recover the ground lost since February 2020? I mean, I think it shouldn't take too long to get back to that. It's not going to be an absolutely easy road, but we should be able to recover the lost ground. But to make sure that after that, we have growth rates, nearer 3% than 1%.
Yeah, so I think it's important that government is looking at how we do things differently, how we reform. The answer isn't simply to do the same, but spend more doing more of the same. We need to look at some of the lessons that come out of COVID. I mean, one of the quick early examples was the way many GPs who had in the past done physical appointments then moved to more telemedicine. And I think if you look across the NHS, I represent a rural constituency. There's much more scope to look at how we streamline some of the patient pathways, how we put more services into telemedicine, how we look at some of the behaviour changes we've seen in terms of people going online for services, how government itself adapts to that. I mentioned data. I think one of the things that came out of COVID was the importance of cross-departmental data. Too much data tends to be siloed in departments, particularly in delivery arm's length bodies, and looking at how we interact with those bodies. Reforms such as on modern methods of construction, if I look at our hospital building programme, our 40 new hospitals, and compare the approach in the past we've taken on health buildings to those of schools, where we've used much more modern methods of construction on the school's estate in order to drive efficiencies, which we've not tended to see, for example, on the health side. Huge opportunities there. Getting the lower quartile up to the upper quartile, looking at best practice. So in many areas, you see similar spend resulting in very different outcomes of performance. And I think that's the sort of area. So there's a whole range of areas I think COVID has illustrated where there is an opportunity to reform. And I think one of the challenges is for government to capture the pace at which we did things during COVID. So if you think of a scheme like the furlough scheme that HMRC launched in a matter of weeks, I think Jim O'Hara, the Perm Sec, said if that had been done in normal times, it probably would have taken a couple of years. And I think there's lessons for government in terms of how we operate, particularly in being more data-driven, looking at what the reforms are. I brought, for example, a team of data analysts into the Treasury, specifically in terms of looking at some of the new skills that we need. And so there's a team also within number 10, looking cross-departmentally at how we use data more effectively. So I think COVID has unlocked significant opportunities for reform, and whether that's on our courts with virtual hearings, whether it's our healthcare, looking at how we approach diagnostics, what we do in the community settings, whether it's in schools with learning loss, and some of the opportunities there in terms of catching up. I think there's a huge range of opportunities for us to change, and that's really what that task force is focused on. But also another one which interacts with it, which is Project Speed, because again, I think you've made this point in the past in terms of just how long infrastructure often takes to build in this country, whether it's a bypass or a railway scheme or so forth. And there's significant scope for us to speed that up. So again, we've got a committee looking at that and how we accelerate the delivery of infrastructure across the UK.
Okay, and terrific. If there's lessons that the public sector's learned about delivering efficiencies, cross-departmental working, better ways of analysing data before making decisions, I'm all in favour of that. I really want to press you there on what lessons you think we either might have learned through COVID, or we knew anyway, but now we've got to implement about the burdens on the private sector, not so much how the public sector are, constructing, how they do a GP appointment or using more virtual meeting techniques or the rest of it. I mean, there have been some. I mean, obviously, COVID has tended to mean a vast swathe of new rules. You social distancing, can't go indoors, all of the rest of it. But there have been some areas where there's been a modest deregulation of what some people might consider to have been pretty absurd rules in the first place. I mean, I had no idea that a restaurant needed a separate license to operate as a takeaway, right? That was expunged by the government in order to allow them to do so. I think there were some previous regulations about when supermarkets could accept deliveries. They couldn't accept deliveries of products in the middle of the night. That had to be waived to make sure the supply lines kept going, and the rest of it. I think there's been a liberalisation in the number of hours that lorry truck drivers can drive on the road, either per day or accumulated over per week or per fortnight, as far as I'm aware, without the number of catastrophic road accidents having gone up. Do you think there are lessons to be learned, not just about how the government runs its affairs and what it might have learned from it and how it can improve its practices in the future, but that we can actually deregulate some parts of the private sector? Most sort of famously of all, the fast track of the vaccine. I mean, hurrah for that. But given that that seems to have worked so brilliantly for COVID-19, aren't there lessons there for actually fast tracking, I don't know, possible cures for Alzheimer's disease or other drugs on the market? It shouldn't be exclusively for COVID-19 that we've cut through red tape. If that's worked so well, there's a lesson there for pharmaceutical regulation in the future, isn't there?
Yeah, well, I think there's a number of points, and we might want to bring that out in more detail, because I think you raise a number of issues with that. I mean, with the vaccine task force, I'm sort of one of the 4 ministers that sit on that task force as the Treasury minister, and I think one of the points there was, again, government operating differently. So whereas in the past, Kate would have had to go to the health department, then the health department to the cabinet office, then the cabinet office to me in the Treasury, by crunching that together, what it enabled us to do is not lower quality, but to add speed by bringing that. So I think one of the points, and you mentioned at the start wanting to at some point get onto the relationship with the EU and Brexit, but the opportunity to do things differently isn't by itself about doing things to a lower standard. It's about doing things in a more bespoke, quicker, more agile way, whether that's, as I say, being data driven, whether it's fixing legacy IT across Whitehall, whether that is culturally how ministers themselves are reaching their decisions. Part of that is also about risk appetite, and both the Chancellor and I are of the view that we want the Treasury to be more radical and to have a higher risk appetite around schemes, and that includes some risk. So with the vaccine task force, we took a decision, but that would have carried risk around some of those contracts because it went well. Everyone praises it. If it hadn't, one has to be mindful that I'm sure a lot of the flack would have come into me in terms of those contracts. So I think there are opportunities, and I think our EU exit opens that up even more so for us to look at doing things differently. And a good illustration of that is our policy around free ports. Again, sometimes I hear people say, well, we had free ports before 2012 when we were in the EU. Are they really that different? Well, yes, they are. I mean, the free ports when we were in the EU pre-2012 were just confined to the port area. They were quite limited in their regulatory scope. There was the seed funding that's been attached. There's quite a lot different about the offer that we've now put in place as part of the wider levelling up agenda for free ports, ensuring that our regulators are much more responsive. And so that will be a key part of the offer to those businesses. So there are opportunities, again, to do things in a consciously different way while still having high quality jobs as the central focus. I think there's also more widely, and this is one of the issues I'm very keen to champion within Whitehall, about making it easier for innovation to get into the bloodstream of government. I think it's quite interesting when you chat to people like Sir Patrick Vallance, and they talk about how large companies such as pharma companies interact with innovative businesses. It's around the partnerships that they build up. And that was very much the approach that Kate and the Vaccine Task Force took, so that we worked to unblock obstacles, whether that was partnering the Oxford University researchers with AstraZeneca, for example, or finding out that if there's a problem around fill and finish or manufacturing capacity, what is it we could do to facilitate that. And I think there's a wider point, and this is where our knowledge assets announcement, again, I think was quite significant, although often doesn't get picked up, is about saying what is the knowledge we have within government that can really drive innovation and change. And I look at, for example, what we spend on diabetics and the impact on people and some of the knowledge we've had and some of the schemes we're launching through that, which again we can get into in more detail. But there's huge opportunities through our knowledge assets to unlock that innovation and actually do so in ways that really transfer to benefits to our end constituents.
Well, let me focus on Brexit then, and these opportunities that open up of doing things in a different way, not necessarily just incinerating regulation, but making sure that some regulations are fitter for purpose or easier to carry out or are tested out more effectively. You were the Brexit secretary for our last 14 months in the European Union. I'm usually in favour of shutting down government departments, right? Vast swathes of them. But I thought there was actually a case for keeping open the Department for Exiting the European Union in order to work through these opportunities. So, I mean, I personally, the IEA took no view, but personally I voted for leave because I saw it as an opportunity to make sure that we had rules and regulations and laws that were fitter for purpose. But you've mentioned free ports, you've mentioned the vaccination programme. What else do you think is now an opportunity for us to regulate better, differently, in a more fleet of foot fashion, perhaps in some areas to regulate less even, right? I mean, let's not run away from the fact that the EU probably does have, we've inherited some regulations surely that we can do without. But what are the opportunities there? Financial services regulation, perhaps, an area that obviously you have a strong background in, because I'm just a little bit worried, and perhaps it's been because COVID-19's knocked everybody and the government off course, that this great Brexit prize of we can now set our own regulatory frameworks hasn't really been grasped in both hands, to put it mildly.
Well, I'll give you two examples. I think, taking your steer with the first one, Mark, and financial services, I think there's opportunities, for example, on Solvency II. And you're right. I mean, some of the EU regulation, the UK had a big part in shaping, and as I say, we want to maintain high standards. But I think on Solvency II, I think if you spoke to the Bank of England and people like Sam Woods, they'd say that there were certain aspects of that which weren't particularly bespoke to the UK markets. And I think there are opportunities there to take an approach that is more tailored to the UK's needs. I think another one is if you look at the work that George Eustice is doing on farming, and I think, to my point about bringing different areas of government spending and government departments together, I think whereas we used to be paying landowners in terms of the quantity of land, the policy now will be to pay for the public good. Well, what do we mean by the public good? Well, that obviously includes flood protection, biodiversity, and so forth. But one of the areas that I would look at is if we look at our mental health challenge and our spend there. We look at the 6 billion we spend on obesity. We look at our commitments on cycling. Then there's opportunities to think about how we use particularly land that the taxpayer themselves own through various bodies, but to think about those other departmental spends and how we actually take a more holistic approach to policy making. And we can do that in a much more bespoke UK fashion. And I think that's one of the opportunities, so that instead of purely looking at DEFRA policy and planting trees for net zero in isolation, we can take a more holistic approach where we're also looking at the appeal, and this will appeal on an intergenerational basis, particularly to some younger voters as well, but take a broader look, not just at net zero, but how we use that space in terms of thinking about social prescribing, thinking about our wider health policy, thinking about getting people more active, and some of the other areas of government spend. So that's the opportunity that comes with Brexit, is to take a much more tailored approach to what the UK needs.
On how Brexit's, we're still in the early stages of it, and it's difficult to split the signal from the noise, right? Because there's been the huge disruption of COVID-19 that it's difficult to know whether X happened because of COVID-19 or because of Brexit, or a mixture of the two, and in which case, in what proportion. But I think I would be bold enough to say, over the experience of the last few months, that one of the incredible lessons of Brexit is how smoothly and quickly the private sector adapts to new regulatory circumstances. I mean, if you go back and look at some of the things we were told to be really worried about at the time of the 2016 referendum, and I'm not suggesting that the people who are arguing this were not sincere, merely that they turned out to be wrong. There was going to be, 29 miles, I think, of queues at the port of Dover. Medicines wouldn't make it onto the shelves. I mean, the four horsemen of the apocalypse were going to turn up at 1 minute past midnight. It was a litany. And look, I'm not suggesting, and some people point this out, that there might be in certain areas slightly more complicated paperwork. But doesn't this actually show that the real motor of a society and the economy is the private sector, which adapts fantastically to almost anything that you can throw at it? And it sort of turned out to be completely, it sort of doesn't really matter whether we're in the EU or not in terms of disruption. And if you consider that COVID has obviously caused an immense amount of disruption, Brexit could not have gone more smoothly, could it?
Well, I think the key is, let's look forward. So you and I were frustrated, I think, Mark, by some of the Project Fear narrative in past years. But as far as I'm concerned, what matters now is we look forward. And I think you're right in the underlying point, which is businesses are hugely talented at adapting. You mentioned our financial services, and they see the opportunity through COP26, through our G7 presidency, in terms of the importance of green finance. That's an area of huge growth where the City of London and our financial services sector has a huge role to play. Financial services as well isn't just a London industry. 2/3 of the jobs are outside of London. It's a huge UK-wide story, whether it's fintech in Manchester or in Edinburgh, for example. So it's a UK-wide industry. It's one we do extremely well, and it's one that is attractive globally in terms of the skills and talents we have. So businesses adapt, and I think there's huge opportunities, and you see this through the work that Liz is doing in terms of the trade deals side. You see it in terms of the global approach that the Prime Minister's taken through, as I say, things like COP26 and Alex Sharma's work. And I think for me, one of the frustrations during Brexit was some opponents characterised it as the UK wanting to retract, the Little Englander narrative, rather than actually wanting to be much more global in our approach. And for those that are sceptical about me saying that, just look at the approach that the Prime Minister has taken in terms of immigration, and saying we want people with skills from around the world to come into our businesses and support our businesses. Let's make it easier for businesses to attract talent. But it is right that that is done with democratic oversight, and that the government can control that. But the work that Priti is doing is to enable people to come most visibly from Hong Kong recently, where the UK again has been very open and accommodating in responding to the challenges there, but also to businesses, and saying businesses need to attract talent. And that is why Priti is bringing forward the approach in terms of visas. And that's very different to some of the narrative that we had in the past. But I think now let's draw a line under that. Let's look forward. And I think we've got a very positive, and the Vaccines Task Force is a good illustration of how we can operate in an agile, quick way as a UK government and as a business community.
So I agree with that. I mean, Global Britain was what attracted me as an opportunity of Brexit, not a certainty by any means, but an opportunity. And I'd rather be part of a Global Britain than a potentially inward-looking European Union. But perhaps just on that note, I can ask you about, if we are going to be an open-minded nation, trading with, sharing ideas with all sorts of parts of the world, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about healthcare. It was just a few months ago that the IEA was caught in a controversial media storm I should highlight that think tanks love being caught in controversial media storms, right? You politicians tend to shun those things. For us, it's our meat and drink to create controversial media storms. Dr. Christian Niemitz on our research team here, our head of political economy, suggested if we looked internationally and across the globe at the performance of various different healthcare systems, the NHS performance during the pandemic was, quote, nothing special. What he meant is it didn't stand out as being obviously the best in the world. It was poor on some things, better on others. Do you think that after the experience of COVID, and I'm sort of treating it as if we're in the final chapter now, I certainly hope we are, and we can look forward to the continual returns of our freedoms, but there's a lot to be said, not just for us in Britain, but right across the world, of comparing how different healthcare systems actually did. It looks like our systems, not necessarily our healthcare systems, but our government delivery system has done very well on the vaccine compared to the European Union, and on procurement perhaps didn't do so well in centralized distribution of PPE at the start of it. Or are we now just so wrapped up in anyone who dares to say that the NHS's performance was anything other than totally immaculate in every single aspect is to be harangued out of public debate? That doesn't strike me as a very open-minded global Britain approach. Surely we've got at least as much to learn from the rest of the world in how we deliver healthcare as we have to teach it.
Well, we should always be open to learning from best practice internationally, and if there are ways, I mean, Tim Ferriss, for example, has just come in to work with Simon Stevens in the NHS in terms of the transformation agenda to look at opportunities for reform. But at the same time, quite rightly, there's huge pride in the NHS because of the workforce and the huge efforts that people have made over the last year. But I think the key for me is we should be data-led and we should look at what the data is saying and challenge ourselves as to where there are opportunities to deliver better. And you mentioned earlier in terms of the NERTS Committee, the National Economic Recovery Task Force, and that is all about saying, how do we take those areas we do well and ensure that all areas, so we socialize that across the piece so that we standardize best practice and ensure that is more widely applied. And if there are lessons from elsewhere, then we should take that on board. And I mean, Chris Whitty said quite early on that it's only after the pandemic we'll really be able to assess what we've done well and the areas there are for us to learn from and to improve. But I think everyone would accept there are always things we can learn. There are always other areas we can improve. And if you look at the variance within the system, clearly there are opportunities for that. So let's follow the data. Let's be humble in terms of where we can learn from, but we won't really know what our performance is compared to others until I think we've been through the full cycle.
Yeah, I agree with that. The movie's not yet over, so it's a bit early to write the reviews, right? But what's the government going to do to make sure that we do have that calm 30,000-foot analysis in a very open way about what we did right and wrong, rather than it descending into some sort of political drama of finger pointing and comparing Don Cummings' WhatsApp messages with those of the Prime Minister or whatever, and it just becoming a slanging match between people perhaps on the Conservative side, but also across the dispatch box. And the main aim becomes to politically blame this person, or this person needs to try to avoid the blame, let's pin it on that person. What's the government going to do to make sure that any kind of inquiry or public discussion and analysis of this is calm, cool, sober, data-led, to use your words, in order that we can make sure when something similar happens again, nothing exactly similar will happen again, that we've learned the right lessons? Or is this just going to be, actually, is it inevitable we're just going to get political mudslinging?
Well, I think in this social media age, Mark, the idea that, whatever I say, it will... we will not see some people who will jump to judgment and will have very fixed views, irrespective of what happens moving forward. I think that's inevitable. There will be people with strong views, and they'll articulate those. I think from within government, and if I come back to my role from a Treasury perspective, one of the questions for us is how are we spending the taxpayers' pound most effectively? So it's a question of looking at where that marginal pound is most effective. So is it, for example, looking at the Get It Right First Time programme, and some of the lessons from that is about high volume, low complexity procedures, and how we approach those. Is it on the diagnostic side? What is it on workforce, so we can ensure we get the right level of work to the right level of qualification, given the pressure? Is it around training, so that we raise standards within particular cohorts? Is it around productivity in terms of new technology and software, and opportunities there? So there's a whole range of different issues, and that's why I come back to this point, which I don't apologise for repeating, being very data driven, because I think from a sort of a decision making point of view, once you actually get better data, the picture becomes so much clearer. It sounds as a very obvious point to make, but quite often the political debate can be focused on one issue. But actually, once you get the proper analysis on it, it may be that issue that's generating the most noise isn't the principal issue which ministers should be concerned about. And therefore, from a Treasury point of view, I want to make sure that we're targeting our firepower, financial firepower, in the most effective way, rather than a scattergun approach, particularly in areas such as health, where there are so many areas one could focus on.
All right, Steve, let me take some of the questions we've had from our IEA guests on the YouTube side in particular. This could come across as me machine gunning you a bit in no particular order, so I'll try and bring
that wouldn't be the first time, Mark.
That wouldn't be the first, won't be the last either, I can guarantee you that. So let me try and bring some rhyme and reasons to them. Edgar Woolner asks, I think this goes back, I think you got this question in as soon as I'd introduced you and mentioned your previous career at Barclays. Edgar asks, can you prove that the provision of documents such as certified passports and utility bills applied to millions of us has actually reduced money laundering?
Well, I have always pushed in government for us to be particularly targeted around the suspicious activity reports and how we take a proportionate approach. So it is less focused on what I used to refer to the granny in Eastbourne opening the local church account, and it is more focused on major flows of money through London as a financial centre. And I know there has been work going on through the Home Office, looking at how we take a more tailored approach on that. So I think it is important that we have the right controls in place, but the more intelligence-led they are, the better.
And do you think, I won't press you too much on the precise example here, do you think that might be an example of money laundering legislation where we've almost built a haystack in order to look for a needle? We seem to have all sorts of extraordinary regulations in place. I nearly had my bank account closed because I was a politically exposed person. There was no remote, trust me, the activity on this bank account, unbelievably boring. It wasn't as if I just won 10 million in the Russian Euro Millions lottery or something. Anyone looking at it with there was no, and I'm not a publicly elected official. It was completely extraordinary. And there was no irregular activity on the account. Now, that's an anecdote, right? You can't necessarily draw that conclusions from that across the board. But that seemed to me, on a personal experience, to be evidence that however well-intentioned the regulations were to stop the bribery of corrupt public officials or whatever, the application of them had actually just was not doing anything at all, other than forcing me to go and see my bank manager in order to plead to her that I wasn't a member of the Russian mafia, and could I please still pay my gas bill through this particular account.
Well, before I came into politics, but the team that I worked with in Barclays would often get some of the concerns from PEPs, including members of Parliament, if they were getting some of those frustrations as well. So I'm very familiar with the issue, Mark. It's not my area of policy within government, but I think if you look at some of the work the government has done on Magnitsky, for example, the targeting, in terms of response from a financial point of view, the work that, as I say, Pretty and the team are doing in terms of SARS, and ensuring that the volume that comes in from financial institutions is better marshalled. There's important roles for professional services, such as lawyers, as well, and accountants. So there's a sort of wide landscape. It is something that colleagues are working on, but I do appreciate that there can be frustrations at an individual level when some of the processes feel particularly disruptive.
Tom Harris asks, this goes back to our conversation about the present tax burden, Steve. Tom Harris asks, does Steve Barclay expect corporation tax receipts to be higher or lower as a result of the increase in corporation tax? He then adds, hint, all the evidence suggests that they will be lower. Perhaps I can add an addendum to that. How do you at the Treasury kind of monitor these things and decide, because there's not an exact science to setting tax rates, but do you expect receipts to be higher in virtue of the corporation tax rate? But even if you do, supposing that your belief turns out to be false and actually the receipts are lower, how well built is our political machine and the Treasury to learn from that and to say, well, actually that tax hike has proved totally counterproductive, let's reverse it?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, actually, because it plays to a debate that goes back to when George Osborne was Chancellor, and the argument being that the point is because the economy fired back up, that's why tax take came up as it had come down. So in terms of your answer to the question, yes, I do expect revenue to be higher, but it's a dynamic factor in terms of also where are we internationally. So I said earlier that we're still the lowest in the G7. So one looks when setting these tax rates. What is the impact in terms of other countries? What is the impact in terms of the wider economy? But yes, I do expect revenue to be higher, but it's something we always keep under review.
Can I just press you a bit on this G7 comparison? Because I get that, and I can see it's a useful talking point for politicians who support the government's line on it. But surely it's not a binary question of whether we're the lowest in the G7 or the highest in the G7. If we're the lowest in the G7, but only by 0.001%, then the incentive to invest in Britain rather than in some other country is absolutely microscopic. If we're the lowest in the G7 by some considerable margin, that could be the margin that influences a decision to open a factory or open your business here rather than somewhere else, right? It's not like a league table as such, it's the actual rate matters and the comparative rate.
Yeah, well, but it's one of a number of factors as well, Mark, because if you look at, for example, the chief economist of Ernst & Young, his comment was actually, in his view, a bigger driver was skills and infrastructure. Now, so I think it's one of the factors. I think my point with emphasizing G7 is it is important to look at whether we're out of sync with other countries. If we were significantly higher than other countries, then that would have an impact. But it is one of a number of metrics.
Christopher Marshall asks, and this touches on a bit which we haven't delved into too much, but about the longer term outlook for the public finances. If we just sort of treat COVID as almost as a war debt, that the government's had to do this to get through, we'll worry about how to pay it back and balance the books over a longer period of time. I mentioned public sector pensions. I think that's going to be meeting that bill, and a triple lock state pension. These are liabilities for the future. You can manage them today, but they get higher and higher. But Christopher Marshall highlights another area that we haven't touched on yet, Steve. He asks, how does Steve reconcile our urgent need to rebuild the economy with the government's highly ambitious green agenda? And I guess my kind of question attached to that would be, and how much is this green agenda going to cost?
Well, we've committed to do a net zero review, as you know. We've got significant investment going into our R&D, so 14.6 billion this year of R&D spend. There's an opportunity there to combine that with the wider agenda in terms of levelling up, so ensuring that when it comes to economic regeneration, if you look at the investment going into Teesside, the investment in Humber, whether that's offshore wind, whether that's carbon capture, some of the opportunities around the green revolution to ensure we get the quality jobs across all parts of the UK. There's a big UK element if you look at the investment in Aberdeen, for example, on energy transition, or the hydrogen hub in Wales. So this is something that applies from a levelling up point of view and a UK-wide perspective. It combines with our R&D investment. but it does come at a cost, and that's why we took the decision, for example, on diesel and petrol to bring that forward. That has an impact, for example, on the auto industry, but the industry has responded hugely positively and has adapted. And I think it comes back to your earlier point, Mark, when you were talking about Brexit. You talked about how adaptable, how quick businesses are to adapt to changing requirements. And I think if you look at that announcement in terms of bringing the phasing out of automobile, car, diesel and petrol cars, bringing that forward, it is an announcement, a regulatory requirement that businesses has adapted to surprisingly quickly. So we will be saying more around the cost of that, but it is important that obviously we address it, because from the wider perspective.
Let me just press you a little on this point, Steve, because how are you attempting to distinguish between, if you like, quality green jobs and jobs that have been created because of government regulation? Let me give you a very extreme example. If the government decided to ban the computer and I at the IEA could no longer use a computer, I would employ a typist to type my letters for me. I'm not sure I would consider that a quality green job, but nevertheless, I would need somebody who could type. How are you distinguishing between the two? And more generally on the government strategy on this, I mean, you mentioned that, right, we're going to phase this out by such and such a date. I'm just a bit flabbergasted that you guys aren't using the price mechanism more. You know, you're stipulating the precise date upon which a diesel engine can't be sold in a car of a particular type. Why not just embrace carbon pricing? You know, and it might well be that products which are high in carbon, therefore just, disappear from the marketplace because they're no longer economically viable. In economic terms, you've internalized the externality. But the government doesn't seem to be using the price mechanism. It seems to be particularly stipulating which products or technologies should be prohibited on a given date and which should be, subsidized or built on a particular date. Why not actually just use some sort of carbon tax?
Sure.
And then let the market work it out?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I said, we'll say more, and the Chancellor's say more on that, and we're committed to say more. What I alluded to was the fact that often the debate on green jobs, green investment is around telling the public not to do things, to stop flying, for example, or to stop eating meat and so forth. And I think one of the opportunities with our research and development budget, and I think it's a much more conservative philosophy, is to how do we embrace technology? How do we enable technology to help us to reduce much of the pressure? And we've seen that obviously with the shift from coal and the progress that has been made there. If we look at housing is a big contributor. So the growth that they'll need to be in areas such as air source heat pumps, moving away from the traditional boilers. If we look at transport, there's opportunities, particularly on shorter journeys. We've got £2 billion going into our cycling. So, when you say about what is a quality job, often that depends on the individual. For some people, that will be actually getting outdoors to plant the trees as part of our commitment to 20,000 hectares of new forests. And for some people, that's the sort of job that they will want to do, to get out and about, not be sat behind a desk. For other people, it may be installing those air source heat pumps as part of addressing some of the challenge on the housing side. So it will vary depending on people concerned.
David Landsman asks a question which, Steve, is relevant to this levelling up agenda. And I'd be really interested, because I'm desperately trying to get my head around it, if you could define for me in 6 or 8 words what the levelling up agenda actually means. Politicians always have agendas and I have to be interested in them. I never understood what Tony Blair's stakeholder society was. I never understood.
You clearly were washing your hair last week when I was giving evidence to the House of Lords. Mark,
in which case I apologise. I will look up that video. I didn't understand what David Cameron's big society was, and I'm a bit. I don't really know what levelling up means in nuts and bolts terms. David Landsman asks, those with an interest in a larger state claim that people in the red wall constituencies expect a bigger state. Do you agree? There's obviously been the Conservatives won the last election in a landslide, but it not necessarily in their traditional areas, right? I think the only seat that fell to Labour was Putney. which is about the 5th or 6th richest seat in the United Kingdom, something like that. And you won a whole range of new areas that had typically returned MPs in the Labour Party interest for generations. What is this sort of levelling up for the poorer parts of Britain? I mean, it seems almost impossible to be against it. Of course, I'd like poorer parts of the country to get richer, but what's it mean? And does it mean a bigger state?
Yeah, it's a fair challenge because it has, I think, been interpreted in different ways by different people. I gave an hour's evidence to the Lords last week on it. And I think, in short, I think firstly, it's addressing this imbalance between our major cities, the productivity gap, and that's much more around the sort of the capital infrastructure, the high-speed twos, the Transpennine upgrades, the roads programme, the hospital building programme, and so forth. But it's also about the human capital. It's around the skills agenda, looking at the lifelong learning guarantee, how we get better adult skills training, how we get better employment-led training. That has the research shows a particularly strong impact on productivity. That's where things like the super deduction tax comes in as well. And in short, it's around targeting, the Prime Minister will often speak about the fact that talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not. This sense that often you may feel you have to leave an area in order to fulfill your potential, and how we better address those opportunities. So the free ports are a good illustration of that, levelling it into communities where there may be fewer opportunities otherwise. So how do you get the skills capital, the human capital imbalances that we have addressed? And in terms of saying, well, are you just saying that, Steve, where's the meat on those bones? What I'd point you to, Mark, which you'll be more familiar with than most, is our technical document, the Green Book. And we went through a review of that at the last spending review, which, with the public didn't necessarily, sort of grab the headlines, but well-respected people like Lord O'Neill, Jim O'Neill, particularly praised that, because instead of in the past being very fixated on the benefits cost ratio of schemes, which often see the same areas then having a stronger case, what the Green Book review is about is ensuring that the funding is far better targeted at those areas that need to be levelled up. So looking at those areas that need the human capital support, and how we target our investments much more in alignment with that. So it doesn't matter whether it's on the health side or the skills side, or on the more traditional areas of levelling up, such as the transport infrastructure and the capital side. There's a range of measures, but it's about targeting those in a much more place-based way. And I think that, again, comes back to data. Government often doesn't have the sufficient place-based data that it needed. And we've had, as I say, a team in Number 10 particularly focused on that, so that these funding decisions can be much more targeted.
But in terms of opportunities, I mean, they're never going to fall equally, right? I mean, let's take a very, very narrow niche sector of the economy. If you want to work for a free market think tank, you're basically going to have to live in London or Washington, DC. Those opportunities do not exist in Rother Valley or Bishop Auckland or Blythe Valley, and they're not likely to anytime soon, right? No,
but I take issue, actually, in that if I look at, say, London, 50% graduates, North East, 33% graduates. One of the things of COVID, people working more at home, you would say in terms of that about the Treasury, Mark. If you want to work for the Treasury, you've got to work in London. No, we're opening an office in Teesside. So some of this is also, yes, people move to work to a think tank in London. There's no reason why, moving forward, a think tank perhaps linked to the fantastic work that Ben Houchen is doing in Teesside, and there may be that with the Treasury there and some of the other work there may be a think tank in Teesside focused on the Green Revolution. Who knows? So that is the opportunity we have.
Fair point. The Treasury is a rather bigger employer than the Institute of Economic Affairs. That's something I intend to correct in the coming years, by the way, Steve, just to warn you, but it is at present. I just want to finish up with two quick questions, both are around tax. One is from our very own Victoria Hewson, our head of regulatory affairs here. She says, what's the outlook for stamp duty? does Steve see the property market and planning reform as part of the levelling up agenda? Might that actually be, if we can get that right, make it even more attractive for me to relocate the IEA to Teesside to provide advice to Ben Houchin rather than being based in Westminster? Are we going to see a shake-up? It also goes to some of the points we were saying about the opportunity to deregulate. Are we going to see meaningful deregulation over planning reform and stamp duty? Surely a tax that's well past its sell-by date, isn't it?
Well, Mark, you're a very experienced hand, and you very craftily, on the one hand, say we're just about to finish, and then lure me into a question on speculating on tax. And you've been around long enough to know, as a Treasury Minister, that's a matter for the Chancellor. So I will leave comments on what may or may not happen on tax to my boss. On planning reform, I think we are looking, and Rob Jenrick has spoken about this, to what are the opportunities, not least as part of Project Speed, to ensure that we deliver the government's objectives, not least on house building, which for many people watching, is a key issue, and we look at what we can do on the planning side as part of that.
Let me have one final bite. I'm not going to push you on a particular tax, but Patrick McIntosh says simplification of the tax system and removal of distortions, particularly those for the wealthy around tax allowances, etc. Are these not the only way forward? Do you think there's a case, whatever the tax burden should be, how much of it should be on property or on company profits as against income or VAT or beer, that we have an unbelievably complex system in the United Kingdom? Is there a case for trying to simplify it, even if it doesn't really alter the burdens at all? But no single human being can get their head around the tax rulebook at the moment, right?
Well, we did have obviously the Office for Tax Simplification when I came into Parliament. So there is a case always around simplification, but then one recalls obviously the difficulty George Osborne had on budget when he tried to do that with what then got labelled around the Cornish pasty tax difficulties. So sometimes simplification on the surface is not always as simple once one gets into the detail. But that's, as I say, more for the Chancellor and for my colleague Jessie Norman, who leads on the tax side. And for me, it's very much about focusing on value for money and place-based data. It
was insisted that I ask you just to finish, Steve. This is a question from the IEA. And we say this is about your life and your career, not just the sort of spot price views at the moment of your present job. What's been the proudest moment of your political career to date? I'm sure it will easily be out-trumped in the months and years to come, but to date, what's been your proudest achievement in your political career?
That's a good left ball question. I think nationally, obviously, as Brexit Secretary, as leaving the EU was a very proud moment, not least because when it started, I was in the whip's office. There were 17 government whips as the only one to leave, and thought in doing so I was probably finishing my ministerial career by taking that decision, but it was something I believed. So that was obviously very pleasing. But locally, we had a derelict building that had been derelict for so long that people had just got used to it and had stopped trying to do anything about it. And getting that fixed, getting a new roof on it, I think was both a useful political lesson for myself as to what can be done, but also the need for persistence in terms of following an issue up locally. And I think ultimately, as members of Parliament, whatever we do ministerially, we are elected to represent our local communities. And so actually what I deliver locally is something I take particular pride in.
Steve, we've had you for more than an hour. Thank you very much indeed for your time and covering so many issues. We've pretty much put the world to rights in the last 63 minutes. So I think it's been an absolute pleasure to host you on the IEA's In Conversation series. I hope it's not too long before we can invite you to a real event at the IEA, whether that takes place in our offices in Westminster or in our new offices in Teesside remains to be seen. But it's been an absolute pleasure to have your company. Steve, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Really appreciate you giving up a good slug of time from your very busy diary. Thank you so much.
That's a pleasure, Mark. Great to see you. And thanks very much to colleagues for joining us. Thanks all.
Steve, thanks very much indeed. That's all we've got time for on this particular IEA show, but there's a lot more coming up in terms of IEA events and broadcasts. An Introduction to Democracy book launch and debate takes place tomorrow at 1 p.m. on our YouTube channel with the book's author, Eamon Butler, debating Garrett Jones, the Associate Professor of Economics at George Mason University and author of the rather controversially titled book, 10% Less Democracy, Why You Should Trust the Elites a Little More. So you might want to tune into that at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Don't forget to join me again on Wednesday at 6 o'clock for our regular Live with Littlewood free market discussion show. Also, I suggest you sign up to our annual Think conference that takes place virtually on the 12th of June 2021. You can find more information on the IEA's website, iea.org.uk. Thanks very much for joining us both on the Zoom side and on the YouTube side. If you're on the YouTube side and enjoyed the discussion, please click the thumbs up. If you're not yet a subscriber to IEA London, please become one, hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to be informed of all of our upcoming events. Thank you again, Steve, for being such a brilliant guest. Thanks everybody for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Over and out.